One more year goes by, and once again I must prepare a new video where I talk about games and news from the industry that I personally found disappointing. However, similar to 2019, I have come to realize that in 2020 I didn't really play anything especially terrible or something that made me regret the money I spent. But that does not mean that there were no video games that for some reason or another did not meet my personal expectations for them, or, in my opinion, wasted the potential they had. So once again, I must clarify that this list is not necessarily made up of bad games. This video is not about the worst games of 2020, but it deals in a personal way with my subjective opinions regarding the games that I tried this year, and I will try to explain as clearly as possible why they left me dissatisfied and disappointed. And well, once I clarified this, I welcome you to this video where I talk about the things that most disappoint me in the video game industry in 2020. In recent years, the work of various journalists and industry workers has brought to light the great amount of abuse suffered by those dedicated to create our favorite games. Insane work hours, lack of promised payments, psychological abuse, racism, sexual harassment, etc. This problem seems to be endemic, from small independent studios to the largest AAA developers. 2020 brought new examples of this when in the middle of the year, more than 70 allegations were posted by dozens of women about sexism and harassment in the industry. Streamers, YouTubers, professional gamers, managers, developers, producers, sponsors, practically every aspect of the video game world have cases of people abusing their position and power. Unfortunately, the number and extent of these cases make it impossible for me to comment on each and every one of them in the way they deserve it, so I will focus specifically on one case that in my opinion encompasses the magnitude of this problem. Let's talk about Ubisoft. In late June, multiple employees and former employees of the French company began to share horror histories regarding the culture of sexism, homophobia, harassment, and violence that exists in all branches of the company. From the office in Bulgaria to the studios in Canada or its headquarters in France, there is not a single branch of Ubisoft without examples of a manager or supervisor abusing their power and worth being protected by their superiors and by human resources. Among all the histories, I must highlight the following. André Gibnier, brand marketing manager for Ubisoft, was accused of rape by one of his victims and was also singled out by other women for his inappropriate behavior. Maxime Ballan, editorial vice president at Ubisoft Toronto, was accused not only of sexually harassing his co-worker, but also of attempting to shock one of his employees when he got drunk during a party. Serge Hascout, creative director of Ubisoft, in addition to harassing his employees, was also accused of drugging his colleagues without their knowledge, giving them cakes laced with marijuana. Also, according to a report, when Serge had created difference with a co-worker, he got angry and said someone should open her mind by fucking her from behind and charge her until she gets it. Unfortunately, these are just 3 examples of the hundreds of reports regarding the culture that exists in Ubisoft. Even worse is that the company was aware of these cases and constantly worked to cover them up. According to an investigation by the French newspaper Libération, the human resource department was completely dysfunctional. For several years, employees who tried to report inappropriate behavior from their superiors encountered a wall. The most common response was, "They are creatives, that's how they work. If you can work with them, maybe it's time you go." And that was the best case scenario. In other situations, women who dared to raise their voices were classified as crazy or sluts who should be ignored. And when a particular director or leader began to receive too many complaints, the most common response was simply to move them to another department in the company. It wasn't until all of these allegations were public and viral that Ubisoft was finally forced to take it seriously. They stated they would investigate the allegations and take steps to resolve the situation. They publicly state that there will be multiple chains within the business, and that an independent company will be in charge of investigating the allegations of its employees. Yet, behind closed doors, the company seemed more interested in covering their own asses than in solving the problem. According to an informant for the Liberation newspaper, during a meeting of human resource managers, the head of the Montreal office declared that if the CEO does not make a public statement exonerating HR, I will leave Ubisoft with half of my team, a sentiment that was apparently supported by a large number of his peers. In other words, the Human Resource Office, which for years ignored allegations of abuse and harassment, now wanted to be exonerated from its own incompetence. Speaking of the CEO, Yves Guillemot, he will cover his back with a pseudo-apology, saying he was unaware of the events that occurred within his company, but now that he was aware, he was taking steps to solve it. This is ridiculous. It is documented that Yves was close friends of several of the accused, as well as working together for decades, which leaves only two options. One, Yves is lying and he knew very well what was happening within his company, but he decided to ignore it to protect his friends. Or 2, he's telling the truth and he really is such an incompetent manager that he had no idea of the abuse epidemic that his own friends and employees were carrying out under his nose. As the investigation progressed, several heads started to roll, not only from the people accused, but also some major players inside the company. This might seem like a happy ending at first glance. However, according to James Stephanie Sterling, a game critic and YouTuber, rather than being fired, these executives were allowed to resign and retire with some of their benefits and shares intact as a result of contractual clauses set upon their employment. So one way or another, they are still profiting from the time they spend abusing their employees within Ubisoft. Meanwhile, the company public relations office immediately began working to have the allegations buried and forgotten, using a tactic we've seen several times in other situations, with the announcement of new video games to distract the public. Call me a conspiracy theorist, but I find it very convenient that after the reports of abuse surfaced, the announcement of Hyperscape, a new video game developed by Ubisoft, was mysteriously leaked to the public. The developer's social media network focused on promoting an online event called Ubi Forward, highlighting that it would announce launch dates for some of their most expected games and other surprises, while conveniently avoiding to mention any detail about the controversy. And as expected, when the day of the event finally came, all attention went to the announcement of the new games without a single reference to the problem. Instead, the CEO of the company decided to upload a separate video on his Twitter account, where he would repeat his pseudo-apology in a clear attempt to distract from the controversy with the announcement of Ubisoft's new games. And worst of all, this idea, as simple as it is, worked perfectly! During the first 2 weeks of the controversy, the public and consumers were quite critical of Ubisoft. However, the public quickly forgot this, to the point where when a person dares to mention the accusations against this company on Twitter or other social networks, they are immediately inundated with responses like, "Nobody cares, we just want to play Valhalla." I don't have the words to describe how incredibly stupid this is. That there are people who are so focused on the new fucking Assassin's Creed, a franchise with more than a dozen games, that they don't care about the fact that the people who created these games, who they claim to love and be fans of, were victims of sexual abuse and harassment. Seriously, how stupid, how empty and pathetic does your fucking life have to be for you to think that your fucking little Viking game is more important than other people's lives and mental health? What the fuck do you win when you do this? Ubisoft is not gonna give you early access to their games for defending them. Guillemot is not gonna come from France to fucking suck you off. fucking bullshit, man! But at least I can try to excuse these fans for the fact that they are, well, fans. They are interested in nothing more than getting their hands on the newest game. The press, on the other hand, the same journalists who were ready to lynch Ubisoft a few weeks before, the only ones in a position to take to task the industry leaders, immediately forgot about everything as soon as the new games were announced. With few exceptions like Jason Schreier or James Stephanie Sterling, all of them became complacent to the hype and marketing that marks this industry. Valhalla was a critical and commercial success, and by the end of the year, many journalists put it as their nomination for the best game of 2020. Wow, what a great job you did. Bravo! Bravo for gaming journalists. Bernstein and Woodward look like fucking newbies next to you. Thank you for your sacrifice on this noble endeavor. A few days ago, it was announced that Ubisoft will develop a Star Wars video game, and the reaction from the public and the press was one of excitement. Ubisoft remained a multi-million-dollar company despite protecting and covering up sexual abusers for years. The CEO who allowed this to happen is still in office. The people who were guilty of this resigned and kept their benefits, and the public has already forgotten all of this. Meanwhile, the victims will have to live their entire lives with the aftermath and the wounds of what they suffer. Fuck this industry. Okay, let's talk about less depressing things. Cyberpunk 2077, developed by CD Projekt Red. By far the most anticipated game of 2020, Cyberpunk 2077 is another example of why you should never be carried away by the hype. Personally, my interest in Cyberpunk never reached the obsessive levels of some other people. However, I always kept an interest in the promotional details of the game, due to the apparent depth of gameplay it will offer. When it was announced that it would be delayed from its original release date on April to September, personally I did not take it as a bad sign, considering that with COVID-19, it was completely normal for several projects to be delayed. However, during this period, news slowly began to leak out regarding the development of the game, that did not paint a good picture of what was happening within the Polish studio. According to reports compiled and verified by Jason Schreier from Bloomberg News, the game didn't have a specific direction for most of the development, and this led to a large amount of crunch during the last year of work to try and launch the game on time. Many fans of the game reacted aggressively to this news, saying that they were fake, or worse yet, justifying the crunch that was imposed on the devs. In September, CDPR ended up ordering its employees to work one extra day a week, noting that the decision was made by a majority vote, but other leaks by company employees indicate that they already had been working overtime for several months. The game will be delayed 2 more times, first from September 17 to November 19 and finally to December 10. While I have always been of the opinion that it's better to delay a game to try to fix its problems than to launch a bad one, it is impossible not to be suspicious when a game is delayed 2 times in a span of 3 months. These suspicions seemed to be validated when reviews of the game began to come out. While highlighting that it was fun and had a great story, they could not avoid the noticeable technical issues and massive amount of bugs in the game. These warnings were mainly dismissed by the public, thinking that critics were playing an unstable version of the game rather than the final fully patched version. However, there were several suspicious things in the way these reviews were handled. The fact that journalists were not allowed to use their own recordings of their gameplay and could only show video distributed previously by CDPR, in addition to only distributing copies of the computer version of the game without giving anyone the opportunity to review the console versions. But perhaps the most important controversy resulting from these game critiques came from Liana Rupert from Game Informer, who warned that Cyberpunk 2077 could cause epileptic seizures. While warnings about possible seizures are common in video games, Cyberpunk is different in that the game has sequences which use a series of flashing white and red lights in a pattern very similar to that used by neurologists when they purposely try to cause an epileptic seizure to diagnose a patient. This sequence caused Liana to suffer a seizure during the game, and she warned that due to its similarity to the system used by neurologists, it was very likely to cause it in other people, including those who were unaware that they were susceptible to this type of attacks. CDPR later fixed this problem with a patch. Unfortunately, this warning was enough for some shithead imbeciles to send Liana multiple videos with flashing lights in an attempt to cause her more episodes, making fun of her illness simply for daring to say something negative about the game they love so much. Then December 10th finally arrived, and what was the result? Well, as expected, the game was quite broken. Glitches, bugs, and optimization issues greatly affected the console version of the game, especially on the PS4. A simple search on YouTube for Cyberpunk bugs can find dozens of compilations, from textures disappearing in cars to police officers magically appearing on empty rooms, a real buffet of glitches. Even the computer version, which is the most stable of all, especially on high-end computers, has several problems, including a bug that could corrupt save files if they exceed 8 MB of storage information. It should be noted that my PC is above the recommended requirements, and even so I had multiple problems, with several frame rate drops and optimization issues, as well as bugs, glitches and crashes. However, my disappointment with this game goes beyond technical issues, and goes into the gameplay itself, which for various reasons never clicked with me. The first aspect that I should highlight about the game is its map, which is without a doubt impressive when you see it for the first time. Night City has one of the most incredible layouts I have seen in an open world game, with a great deal of verticality in its structure, huge buildings, streets full of people, and an architecture with a unique personality. Unfortunately, this initial impression quickly faded as the hours of the game went by. Although Night City is huge and beautiful, there are not many things to do in it. Side activities are practically non-existent outside of the quest. All stores tend to sell very similar items, and NPCs wander aimlessly through the streets without reacting to your actions or the events of the story. This ended up making me feel that despite its beauty, the city was much emptier than it seemed, and there was not enough substance to do in it other than moving from one quest to the next. And speaking of moving within the city, I must say that at least in the PC version, the handling of the vehicles seemed quite off, with a terrible responsiveness every time I tried to brake or take a curve. So I just prefer to use the fast travel options and walk towards my objectives. In terms of role-playing mechanics, Cyberpunk offers a wide variety of possible specializations and enhancements to customize your playstyle. However, some of them seem much more useful than others. During my game, I tried two different builds for my characters. My first character specialized in stealth, hacking, and handguns. The first thing I noticed is that the handguns, at low level at least, are extremely weak, to the point where they feel useless. Hacking, on the other hand, seemed extremely powerful to me, offering you quite a few abilities to both distract and damage your enemies. Finally, stealth seemed a bit dysfunctional. Sometimes enemies passed next to me without detecting me, while at other times enemies detected me through walls. After a few hours of gameplay, these inconsistencies in the AI ended up frustrating me, and I decided to create another character, one that specialized on rifles, shotguns, and constitution. The more aggressive approach of this character was a better fit for me, because the combat and shooting mechanics in the game are much more polished. However, the AI still had issues here, since many times it didn't know how to react when I flanked them or throw a grenade at their feet. And despite all this, if there is one thing I should applaud on Cyberpunk, is the incredible story that the writers managed to create. This game has amazing characters that I connected with almost immediately thanks to the great work the writers and voice actors put bringing them to life. The quests are fun and interesting, from beating a pair of twins in a boxing match to saving a suicidal artificial intelligence, or even saving the one and only Jessie Cox from running around without pants. If it wasn't for these histories and these characters, I honestly would have quit the game. And I think this is what disappoints me the most. There is obviously a heart and soul behind this game. Obviously there were hundreds of people who worked on it and did their best to create something of quality, but they clearly fell short. And if the recent article published by Jason Schreier is true, the problem came directly from above, from directors and producers who did not know how to give a proper direction to their developers, asking them to do very complicated things in unrealistic periods of time while feeding the public hype in a ridiculous way with promises impossible to fulfill, knowing very well that they would have to launch in December with a product very different from the one they had promoted. Perhaps with further updates, Cyberpunk can become the game that it should be. With better artificial intelligence, more side activities, better optimization and not technical problems, and I hope that one day that will be the case. However, in its current state, it's undoubtedly a disappointment. Iron Harvest, developed by King Art Games. I honestly feel a bit bad for including Iron Harvest on this list. Developing a strategy game is a complicated job. You have to design and animate units, balance all the factions, create an entertaining campaign and multiplayer, all while still balancing the maps for each of these gameplays. Even studios with experience in the genre and a fairly large budget have ended up making some terrible games. So when I consider the fact that King Art Games is a relatively small studio with a budget obtained through Kickstarter, it is impossible for me not to consider that they did the best possible job with the limitations they had. Yet, despite considering all this, I can't help but say I was disappointed in this game. I'm not going to talk about faction balancing or anything like that, because I personally did not test the multiplayer mode. Instead, I'm going to focus on talking about the single player campaign. At first glance, the campaign seems like it has everything it takes to become one of my favorites of the year. An alternate history where World War I was fought with mechs, a Polish resistance girl with a bear, a sexy Russian spy with a Bengal tiger, a sexy German general with two wolves, a sexy Nikola Tesla with killer robots, a super sexy Rasputin, giant robots with sides, a respectable variety of units with unique designs and interesting abilities, and an excellent visual style. And despite all this, the campaign for me is only a 3.6 Rotten. Not great, not terrible. Maybe it's because my playstyle, which tends to be quite defensive, but many of the missions in the game felt very tedious. The objectives on the missions are the same already seen in the RTS genre since the 19th. Defend a valuable objective, destroy the enemy base, survive an X amount of minutes, the typical commando mission with a limited number of units, etc. None of this offers anything interesting or unique compared to other games of the genre. There is nothing wrong with this in itself, but at the same time, it doesn't help Iron Harvest to stand out from other games who have come before. The first few minutes of each mission is basically a game of musical chairs, where the artificial intelligence and I were constantly circling the map, capturing and recapturing the same resources, until I finally had enough to establish a defensive perimeter around my resource and start building an army. While the game has a respectable variety of units, the variety of buildings is not existent. All the factions share the same production buildings and are similar interdefensive structures, such as bunkers, sandbags and mines. Nothing separates them from each other, and all the bases end up looking almost identical. At the same time, there are no interesting or unique upgrades beyond leveling up your barracks and factories once to increase your population limit and unlock more powerful units. It should also be noted that although the units are varied, it is almost impossible to take advantage of them all, due to the very low population limit, so training basic units becomes a waste. It is much more profitable to just build your stronger mech and constantly repair them. Commando missions are insufferable, depending largely on the old trial and error system, where you constantly have to reload your game over and over again to try different things until you find the right way to keep progressing. The movement speed of some units is extremely slow, and some of the maps are quite large, so moving your army from one side to the other can take a long time. This situation is made worse by the mechs having a pretty bad pathfinding system, constantly moving in directions you didn't order them to. On top of this, Iron Harvest released with quite notable optimization issues. It was not uncommon for the game to drop below 20 frames per second during some battles. But maybe my biggest problem with Iron Harvest is that the more I played, the more I realized I was bored. It didn't matter that they had huge mechs or sexy Russian spies with Bengal tigers, the game just wasn't entertaining me. And I think there is no bigger disappointment to a game where you fight Nikola Tesla's killer robot with giant mechs than it being so boring that I much rather do my dishes than continue playing. Okay, here we go. Doom Eternal, developed by id Software. Okay, before you light the fire and throw me on the fire, give me a second to explain. I'm not saying that Doom Eternal is a bad game. I'm not saying the dozens of positive reviews are wrong. I'm not saying that people who consider it one of the best games of the year are misled. On the contrary, I am completely convinced that all the accolades and recognition Eternal has received are well deserved. However, in this video I'm not trying to make an objective criticism of the games that disappoint me, nor am I trying to make an analysis of their technical aspects. I am approaching this from the perspective of what I feel, which is clearly 100% subjective. And from that subjective perspective, I must say that Doom Eternal didn't gel with me. To understand why, it is necessary to explain first that the 2016 version of Doom is perhaps one of my favorite shooting games of all time. I absolutely love everything about that game. Its animations, its gameplay, its mechanics, its music, everything. So when Doom Eternal was announced, I was 100% aboard the hype train. I closely follow all the announcements, the trailers, the development blogs. This was without a doubt my most anticipated game of 2020. I can't describe exactly how excited I was when March 20 finally came around and I was able to play Eternal. I completed the game twice. The first time when it came out in March, the second when it was released on the Xbox Game Pass for PC in December. This is very rare, because I hardly ever replay a video game that I already completed once. In fact, I could count on my fingers the amount of games I have finished more than once in the last 4 years. What I want you to understand with this is that I really wanted to like Eternal. When I saw all my favorite critics and the public saying how much they love this game and how it is one of the best action games ever, I couldn't help but wonder why I didn't feel the same way. I tried to force myself to love it, but the reality is that I just never managed to connect with Doom Eternal the way I did with Doom 2016. And why did this happen? Well, as I say, this is due to a combination of expectations and personal taste. The first thing I noticed about Doom Eternal is the change in the art style, especially on enemies. The demons in Eternal are more colorful and brilliant, much closer to the style of the games of the 90s. While this is not a bad thing in itself, I personally like the models used in Doom better, as they look scarier to me. In the same way, I prefer the way in which Doom 16 presented its items and weapons, and how they were integrated into the level design, helping overall with immersion. In Eternal, these items are simply floating in the middle of the map in a very similar way of the shooters of yesteryear. Mick Gordon's music is still incredible, full of quality and energy, but I personally didn't like the soundtrack for this game as much as the one for Doom 2016. While it has some excellent songs, none of them capture me the way BFG Division or Rip and Tear did. The style of the cutscenes also changed in the sequel. While in Doom 16, the first-person perspective is maintained at all times, rarely taking control away from the player, in Eternal the cinematics are constantly taking you out of this perspective, showing you things in third person or taking control of the character to show unnecessary things like the opening of a new door or a battery that you picked up. In my opinion, Doom 16 helped maintain the immersion and illusion that you were the Slayer by committing to the first person perspective. Eternal also takes a much bigger focus on the story, adding an epic space fantasy backstory that unfolds over thousands of years, recounting the rise of the Slayer and everything related to the species and characters involved in its narrative, which I found completely unnecessary. Doom 16 had a simple but functional story, appropriate to its purpose, which could be ignored by the player if desired. Except for a couple of segments where you had to wait while Hayden did an info dump, the rest of the game could be beat without more context than "there are demons on Mars, go kill them!" For its part, Doom Eternal constantly gives a front row seat to its lore, either with quite extensive collectible text, cutscenes, or with constant conversations with other characters. And the reason I said it's unnecessary is because the strength of this franchise has never been in its lore, and the focus on it only helps to expose that it's probably the weakest link in the game. While it is not bad, there is nothing to write home about, since it is full of typical genre cliches and retcons to the previous game. Finally, we have to talk about the gameplay, the most successful element of this game. The first thing I'll say is that I personally don't like the platform segments they added, but this has less to do with Eternal and more to do with the fact that I simply never liked platforming in games with a first-person perspective. The second thing I will say is that my opinion of the combat changed a lot between my first and second runs. The first time I completed Eternal, I ended up quite frustrated and tired with the game because the combat system never quite clicked with me. I felt that weapons never had enough ammo, and that the number of mechanics the game had made everything unnecessarily complex. It wasn't until Run 2 that I finally started vibing with the combat. The big problem is that I was trying to play Doom Eternal the same way I was playing Doom 2016, mainly depending on 2 or 3 super upgraded weapons and using the rest as support. Eternal in this sense is extremely different from its predecessor. To be successful in this game, you must make use of your entire repertoire of weapons, secondary functions and utilities. Combat is more similar to a puzzle, where you must use certain specific functions against certain enemies or in specific situations to get the most out of it, and thus make things easier during combat. Once I understood this, the combat became much more enjoyable and entertaining. Even so, I must say that Eternal kicked my ass. The difficulty is much greater than its predecessor and made me realize that sadly I am too old for this kind of game and I just suck at it. In conclusion, Doom Eternal, the problem is not you, it's me! I am the one who had extremely high expectations for this game, hoping it will be a strict continuation of what Doom 2016 was, when clearly Eternal seeks to be its own video game, with its own style and gameplay. Unfortunately, my own expectations and limitations did not allow me to enjoy it as much as other people, and I think that is the biggest disappointment I had this year. Marvel's Avengers. developed by Crystal Dynamics. Let's be honest, none of you remember this game existed, and frankly, neither did I. I honestly would not even bother to mention it if it weren't for the fact that Crystal Dynamics would make better use of their talent developing a new Legacy of Kain. But nah, Square Enix will rather put them to work on this hybrid abomination of Destiny and Marvel. Meanwhile, the Kain franchise is dead and buried, after the geniuses behind Final Fantasy decided that the best way to revive a game specialized in single-player history-focused campaigns was through a fucking multiplayer PvP game, which, to add insult to the injury, they cancelled in 2016. Where is the Legacy of Kain, Square Enix? Why haven't you made a new Legacy of Kain? Where is Raziel? Where is Borador? Give me Soul River or give me that, you motherfucker! And with this we come to the end of another disappointing year. Disappointed by the video game industry, disappointed by the unnecessary hype and fanaticism, disappointed by the war, and disappointed in myself. But hey, there is always the possibility that 2021 will bring much better things. And if not, well, I'll see you in next year's video. What is not disappointing is the support of all of you. Guys, girls, and non-binary friends. I hope you enjoyed this video and that my personal opinions did not offend you. Please share your thoughts in the comments and let me know which games you found disappointing in 2020 or why my opinion of Doom Eternal is trash. I also want to give my biggest thanks to Honest Fictionist for proofreading this script and trying her hardest to make it into something that resembles proper English. In any case, we'll see you back shortly for my top 10 of 2020. I've been Temeduso, thank you very much for watching and until next time.